Welcome to the Radically Christian Bible Study Podcast. I'm your host, Wes McAdams. Here we have one goal: learn to love like Jesus. We have a very special and kind of unique and different episode today. We are recording this at the McDermott Road Men's Retreat, and so we are, as they used to say about the sitcoms, we are recording this in front of a live studio audience. So welcome men to the podcast. Fantastic. And we are going to be discussing the idea of ambition, career, but also within the context of the book of Ecclesiastes. And I have a very special guest with me today, Bob Tabor. Welcome to the podcast, brother.
Hey, thank you.
I am so excited to have you. I've honestly wanted to have you on the podcast for a long time. Your wife has been part of the podcast for a long time. Those that have listened to the podcast recognize the name Beth Tabor because Beth used to transcribe our podcast for years. She did that even before I knew you guys lived in our area and before you were members here at McDermott Road. So I've been a fan of the Tabor family for a very long time.
Well, it was funny because Beth would say, "Oh, you got to listen to the next one. The Wes is gonna, the next topic is so good," and she would like tell me everything about it. Then I was like, "Well, that's good enough. I don't need to listen to it." But then I would listen to it. I'm like, "Oh, that's pretty great." And yeah.
So she would transcribe it and summarize it.
She was a court reporter,
Yeah.
or she is a court reporter, and she takes depositions. And so there was somebody who requested, for hearing, people that had hearing disability, it would be great if they had a transcript. And she's like, "Well, I can do that." And I think she reached out to you, and that's how it all started.
Yeah,
It was long before we started coming here. In fact, my son and his wife came here for a visit, and they introduced themselves.
Yeah.
And you thought that we probably lived somewhere across the United States,
Vienna or something. I had no idea where.
just down the street.
Right? Yeah, no idea. Well, thank you for everything that you guys have done for not only for the podcast, but you guys are such a huge encouragement to me. And we've already talked about a lot of the things we're going to talk about today. And so I know that it's going to be a blessing to everybody that's listening. So we're talking about ambition. We're talking about goals, and we live in an interesting culture, and trying to apply the ideas about contentment and even the ideas that we find in Ecclesiastes to our life and to our work as men, just as Christians, can be really unique. And you have, as everyone does, a unique story and journey. So I would love for you to just tell us a little bit about your journey with career and ambition and how that's all worked out in your life.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. So for those of you who don't know, today I work at Microsoft. I am in the Learn organization. We write documentation and training content, and I specifically write about the intersection of the cloud and AI and software development. So I am the Go and the Python end-to-end, write about Go and Python, two programming languages, scenarios on Azure, which is our cloud platform. I helped to build this new content area, AI for app developers. So we leaned in really hard. Microsoft made some investments in OpenAI. And so, I write and help developers understand. Then there's a team of people who do that sort of thing. And then I am a writer on GitHub Copilot for Azure, which is a new tool. And it's the intersection of all of those three crazy areas all come together. And so, yeah, my experience at Microsoft is that it's a high functioning environment that attracts the smartest, most ambitious people that I've ever had the pleasure of working with. And so I guess it's at this point I probably need to say, as a disclaimer, as they do on a lot of these sorts of things, that the views and the opinions that are expressed during this podcast are my own and not necessarily those that reflect my employer. So I wanted to start off that on the right foot there. A little. So, and you can understand how fraught conversations about the Bible can be in a large company. So definitely have to always be aware of that. And yet, the more I reach out and I float the hints out there, the more people that I meet that are believers.
Yeah.
And that's very encouraging too. So I guess the conceit why I'm here is like, on some level, he's sitting with Wes. He must know something, and I absolutely know nothing. I've only made mistakes. I can tell you what not to do. What I'm going to tell you is a cautionary tale about selfish ambition before I even joined Microsoft. So I guess that kind of takes us out of that realm. I describe myself, like I sure many of you do too, as chronically ambitious. I mean, just in the last 24 months, I finished my MBA. I've changed my job role at Microsoft, taken on a whole new set of responsibilities related to learning large language models, retrieval augmented generation. I've done a lot of writing for documentation and blog posts for Microsoft. In my spare time, I've taught myself game programming with Unity. I've been studying swing trading strategies, technical analysis, chart patterns, and I spent the last 6 months building an algorithmic stock trading platform. And I've been telling folks, and I think I showed Quentin. He came up to my office, and I showed him what I was working on. So I am chronically ambitious, and sometimes that's good, and it's led me to very cool places, and sometimes it's bad, and it's led me to the depths of what I would consider like what you wouldn't want out of a follower of Jesus. And so, yeah, when you talk about journey, that journey that I've been on of this explosive success that I had at a very specific point in my career, and I'm going to tell you about in just a little bit. It informs how I understand Ecclesiastes and how I look at and understand ambition. And so, yeah, I'm going to share a chapter of my life, and this is where the vulnerability and the transparency comes in, is because it's going to make me look like a monster, or maybe a little bit of a robot at times. And there was definitely a period of time where I was not growing towards Jesus, but I was growing away from Jesus, and I was letting my ambition get in the way of it. And so, yeah, that's what I wanted to share with you. And then, as we have the opportunity to open the floor up, I'd love to hear your experiences as well, and we can get into that a little bit later. But basically, um, uh, so Beth and I got married young. I preached for the first 18 months of our marriage while I was finishing up school, getting a degree in management information services. And 18 months into preaching, I realized, at a super small congregation in Chicago where I grew up, I realized this is absolutely not what I was meant to do. Like, the next closest person in age was double our age, and it just was not a good situation. There was no like real training available for me at that particular time. And so I decided to move on. Problem is, when you don't interview through your university for that first job, it's difficult to get a toehold in that industry. So I went for a couple of years, but finally got tied in and got started on my career. But at that point, we've racked up credit card debt. We've got medical debt because we had a child without having health insurance. And so I've always constantly felt like I was behind the eight ball. Like, I was always behind. I needed to play catch up. So now I'm in the mode of taking risks and working harder than I probably should have. And that really sets off, if there's any wisdom, it's like, hey, get everything lined up well before you take the next step in your life. But, we didn't have those voices in our lives that could have made those recommendations to us. So, any rate, I finally did get hired by a company. A friend of mine at church actually helped set up the interview. I got hired at Ernst& Young, and the very first day I was there, a gentleman by the name of Rich Anderson reached out to me. He was going to be the project manager of something I was assigned to do. He's like, "Have you ever heard of this thing called the internet?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I've heard of it, but I haven't done much with it." And he's like, "Oh boy, we're going to do some stuff with it." And so I got to learn how to do web development and some pretty high end stuff. And the project that we worked on, it was called Ernie. We sold consulting services over the internet. And it was nominated by Michael Dell of Dell Corporation for inclusion in the Smithsonian Institute of Technology. So it was a great toehold in that industry. And so from that point, I said, cash now is the time to cash in, right? And so I became a contractor, and in IT, that just means I don't work full time for anybody. I jump. I'm a free agent. So 3 months here, 6 months there, a year here. And so, yeah, when the internet was booming, I was right in the middle of it. And I would go to an interview at a Starbucks, and 5 minutes later, I'd have the job. And it was just that easy. I once quit a job at lunch at 10 a.m., and by noon, I had another job, and I was sitting in another chair. Yeah, I mean, it was just ridiculous back in those days. And so I worked at Sprint, KPMG, American Heart Association, Mary Kay Corporation. And so it was during that time that in 2000, Microsoft announced that they were releasing a new developer platform. And I'm like, okay, this is time for me to make my next step. So I started blogging about some of the things that they were coming out with. And that blog led to a publisher reaching out to me and said, "Hey, would you like to write a book about it?" And I said, "Absolutely, I'd love to write a book." So here's a book I wrote, Microsoft.NET XML Web Services, by Robert Tabor. They published it in Russian. They published it in Chinese. I wish I could say
I don't even think I could read the English version, just to be safe.
I wish I could say it was a bestseller, but one of the big problems with writing a book while the software is being developed is that things change. And so by the time that it hit the market, the technology had fundamentally changed out from under me. So if you go to the Amazon reviews, they're not so great, but it wasn't completely my fault. I learned a lesson there. But it was while I was writing this book, I reached out to the publisher and said, "Hey, would you like to, it'd be so much easier for me to like show people what they should be doing rather than write about it. There's this new software called Camtasia that allows me to record my screen and then narrate as I record. And then we could add a disc with a bunch of videos on it." And they're like, "No, we're not interested. No." And this is before YouTube or any video on the internet. I always kind of felt like there was going to be a convergence at some point of internet and video. So I said, "Okay, well, I'll do it myself." I recorded a bunch of videos, gave them to friends and coworkers at the Mary Kay Corporation there on Dallas North Tollway. And they said, "These are great. You should put them on the internet." I'm like, "Great, I will." And so I put them out and I said, "Hey, if you like these videos, give me $10 to help me with bandwidth." And the first day I made $350. And I was like, "Holy cow, that'll never happen again." But it happened that day and the next day. And then it was $400 a day. And now that's like that. I'm thinking that's probably enough to cover salary and all my expenses. And so I'm like, if I could just quit what I'm doing here as a software developer at this corporation and just work for myself for 3 months, I could create more videos and then I'll go back and I'll find another contract. I'll get back into contracting. And I just never had to go back. It was just kept escalating and doing well. And I never was like, it never got like crazy out of control until 2 years later, Microsoft reached out to me and they wanted to license the videos that I created for every university and high school through their academic alliance. And I'm like, absolutely. So I shot them a number. I gave them another number and they were like, and so they gave me a big influx of cash. And then that individual who kind of brokered that deal, Daryl McDade, he said, "Hey, I'd like to introduce you to some people." And these were folks that were building, the next version of Visual Studio, which is the tool from Microsoft where you write code and you build applications. And they were about to release Visual Studio for free. At that point, it had always been on a subscription base. You had to pay $500. So it was very much a barrier to entry. Now they were going to make this development tool free. And they said, "Hey, would you create some videos for us to like show people how to use this?" I'm like, "Absolutely." So there were several groups and they said, "What?" And this is the famous line that everybody says in startup space is like, "What we can't give you in cash, we can make up for in exposure." But at that point, I was like, I'm ready for anything. So I said, "Absolutely." So they gave me a few $1,000s. It was fine. And I just went to work for 6 months and just created a ton of videos. And I didn't know what they were going to do with them. They wound up putting them on the front page of the Express editions in 2005. So when you open up the program, all you saw were like 20 of my videos. And on each video, I got to say, "Hi, this is Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net, where you can learn the latest blah, 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 blah." I had a whole spiel memorized, and I got to do that on every video. And so overnight, literally overnight, my business went from paying the bills to like 10x that. And then on some days, it would be 20x, 30x, 50x. There was one day that I made more in one day than I made my entire 18 months of preaching.
Wow.
One day. And so the scale got crazy. Now, unfortunately, it's not just that. It was 1,000 emails per day coming in. People with just like, "Oh, these videos are great. They helped me get a job. They changed my life," to, "How do you do this? I didn't understand that. Can you make something different?" to, "You're horrible at what you do. You're great at what you do." I mean, the whole gamut of, and it was overwhelming. I couldn't keep up. I felt compelled to reply to everybody and I just couldn't. So I hired my first employee just to answer my email 8 hours a day. She did it every day. And then I hired more people and more people. And it got to be a large enterprise. I kept doing work for Microsoft. They kept featuring my work. At some point, my videos were pretty much, if you came to one of the developer sites on Microsoft, you would see me there. So there were evangelistic channels like Channel 9. Later on, there was Microsoft Virtual Academy, where they would have a lot of training and things of that nature. And typically, my videos were the most popular on those platforms. So this is all great, right? And if you think that, like, at this point, Bob is just bragging, you would get a pretty good sense of the ego that I had at that period of time, where people are telling you you're great, you're making a ton of money, you're anything that you ever thought you wanted in life, I could have it. There was no limit to that sort of thing. But as we all know, pride goes before. And boy, then there's another relevant saying that the bigger they are, yeah. And so this is where we get real about what actually happens next. So, um, I was miserable because I was working all the time, and there was a lot of demands for my attention, and I was extremely unhappy with everything. Uh, but I was not unhappy enough about it to walk away from it, because all I felt like, if I just work harder, if I just do more, if I just do this next thing, I can get out from under this or that and this or that. There was no real exit strategy per se. But then there was a built-in exit strategy for me, which was August or September of 2008. Do you guys remember what happened in August or September of 2000? I can tell you what happened in August or September of 2008. My sales decreased one-third during George Bush got up and there was a congressional hearing. And when people started all come to the realization at the same time, the economy's going downwards and it's going to go down fast. My sales went down a third and they never came back. And it was just the death by 1,000 paper cuts from there. And so I told my employees, I'm like, I'm not going to fire anybody, but I don't know where this is going. My sales are going down. Add on to that I was the only person doing what I was doing at that time. But then there are now competitors, there's YouTube. So, I'm looking at this as this situation is not on an upward trajectory, it's on a downward trajectory. And so it took a couple of years, but it got to the point where I was brought pretty low and I was seriously depressed. Like, laying on the couch every day, staring at the ceiling, wondering what I had done wrong and what I could have done different, to the point when Beth said at some point, we got to get you some help. Like, I was in the deepest pit that one could find themselves in, frankly. And I had no idea how I was going to get out of that. And I just kept asking myself why, over and over, sort of thing. And so fortunately, she did all the footwork. She found a therapist, a psychologist. I got prescribed all kinds of drugs, which wasn't all that valuable. Honestly, the therapy was the most valuable part of it. And it took some time to unravel. But things like this, they don't get solved overnight. Even if you make these like observations about yourself, some realizations, and my therapist was awesome about helping me come to some conclusions, and which I'm going to go through here in a moment. It takes years to figure out what's next and where do I go from here. But I'm going to go through some of the mistakes that I made during this whole process. So the number one mistake.
Before you do that,
Yeah,
I
please.
mean, I just want to say, like, as you introduced this, you said that this story would make you sound like a monster or like a robot, but I don't think it does at all. I think it makes you sound human, and I think that this is why in a minute when we get to Ecclesiastes, I mean, this is so relevant for everyone because everybody may not have a story that has that sort of as big of an up and a down, but everybody has lived that in some way, one way or the other, or they wish that they could. Isn't that the thing that we wish we could experience that high, but not realizing that it also comes with that low. So I think that yours is a very human story. So thank you for your
Yeah.
vulnerability.
Well, I think the robot or the monster comment comes from the unbridled ambition. I think that was the term that somebody used last night. Like, there was no limit to what I would work around the clock. I would work every waking hour. When I was at church, worship services, I'm looking at I built my own custom report. I could hit it from my phone. How much did I make in the last hour? How much did I make in the last 5 minutes? Oh, I got another sale, another $250 sale. Whew, another $250 sale. Today's a good day. Man, I need to send out an email tonight. And so it pulled your focus away. And there was a line I would not cross, and that was with my kids. Like, I remember my dad always being a little too busy for me, and I'm like, "I will never do that." So whenever they came up and I was able to work from home during this whole time, whenever they came up, I would turn away and give them my full attention because that was a line I wouldn't cross. But other than that, I would spend every waking hour thinking about this and 0 hours thinking about God, and get 0 hours giving him the credit and giving him any glory because there wasn't enough space in my mind to glorify God because I'm pretty awesome,
Mm.
you know? And that's where the selfish ambition aspect of this came along. I always, and we'll get to this a little bit later, but I could justify it by saying, "Oh man, when I make more money, I can do more good in the church. I can do this for these people who need help. I can do these things for my kids. I can do this for my family." And I mean, that's the lie you tell yourself when it's really, well, this car that I've always wanted, I'm actually going to buy it now. I have enough American Express points that I can get a free weekend in the Four Seasons in their best suite. Those sorts of things. I can fly first class to Seattle when I need to go up to Redmond and meet with some folks. And so, yeah, that was the problem.
Yeah.
That's where the monster came in.
Yeah. I want to come back to you. I know you had some other things that you
Yeah.
wanted to cover, but I love that we keep using that phrase selfish ambition, because this weekend we've been talking about ambition, and the way that the New Testament, sort of describes that, or at least in English, is we translate that as selfish ambition. And I think that we do sort of justify our ambition to say, oh no, but I'm ambitious for good things. I'm ambitious to provide for my family. I'm ambitious to, make a difference in the world. I'm ambitious to, all of these things, when I think that your vulnerability in explaining that it really was selfish is the type of honesty that we need to practice. And we need the example of someone who will show themselves and open up their chest and show the world that, hey, I was being selfish and my ambition was selfish and it was about me, even though there were ways I could justify it, to kind of show us that, because I think sometimes we're just not willing to be that honest.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't know about anybody else. I can only speak to my experience here, but there is an entangling of, because it wasn't 100% bad intent. Like,
Sure.
we did help people and we did do good things, but I say we, I'm not throwing Beth under the bus on this. This is 100%
Mm.
Bob. Bob liked the nicer things in life,
Yeah.
right? And I got accustomed to that particular lifestyle. And yeah. So any rate, mistakes. I
Yep.
want to go into some specific mistakes, and probably the number one, and a lot of this is, I think, more relevant to younger people who might hear this, but maybe it helps some of you here as well who are in middle age or older. And that's one, is tying your identity to the success or the failure of your job, to your business, or really to anything else. Like, you are not your job, you are not your business. You have to keep that separated. For me, if it's a good day in sales, Bob is having a good day. And if it's a bad day in sales, Bob's having a bad day. And, it tend to come out in the way that I talk and treat other people. And so, what a horrible
Mm.
way to live your life. But that was my reality. Yeah. Um, and then I think the second mistake was reading your own press clippings. And, as that old expression goes, like reading what people say and it feeds your ego, and you believe to think that, yeah, I am the best in the world at what I do. And I've actually said that about myself before. And what a cringy thing to say in retrospect. But I was just feeding my own ego. And so, not giving God any glory, not thanking him. Yeah, I really wish I could go back in time and kick that version of Bob in the behind and tell him, you need to calm yourself down, son.
Mm.
Mistake number three, thinking that if I just worked harder, I could be more successful. And I think Ecclesiastes has something to say about that
Yeah.
specifically. I'll come back to that in a minute. Mistake number four, filling up all of my time on the business, just that hyper focus. I was able to work from home, but if I had an extra hour, it was not in service to the Lord. It was in service to the business. And, I think that's something that a trap we can all fall into when we're ambitious. Even if, and I would say about ambition too, is that on the outside, from somebody else's perspective, having selfish ambition or having healthy ambition, it may not look much different. A lot of it has to do with your motivations.
Yeah.
and where it's coming from on the
Mm.
inside. So
Yeah. Well, let's dig into Ecclesiastes and let's talk about how how relevant that is. And I've said for a while now that somebody needs to write a book, the Gospel according to Ecclesiastes, because I don't know that there is a better, more relevant book to approach modern American successful or not, by worldly standards, people, just secular people. I don't know that there's a better way to sort of begin that conversation with people, because the wisdom of Ecclesiastes in some way is self-evident, right? The idea that, hey, all of this is smoke and mirrors. All of this is, the Hebrew word is hevel. All of this is going to, disappear. It's all here for a limited time. It's a vapor and then it's gone. Or the future is mysterious and we don't really know what the future holds. And all it takes is being around for 5 minutes before you sort of understand that. But accepting it is something else. And even though we sort of know it, I'm sure that even in all of those moments that you described, you knew that. There was an aspect of you that you knew that. You knew that all of this could be gone in a heartbeat, but yet we still pursue those things that are, at the end of the day, hevel. They're smoke. They're a vapor. They're a mist. They're here for a short time.
yeah, and I think when you grow up in the church, I heard all the lessons that a 32-year-old could hear on Ecclesiastes. I knew, like you said, on some level, these things that even, and my dad would even point things out to me like, you worry an awful lot, like about these sorts of things, and a lot of Ecclesiastes goes to what you worry about, and what you think about, and so he pointed those things out to me, but. And this is the word that when we had lunch that you really indexed on, which was seductive. It's so seductive that you do this bargaining with yourself that you think, I know what the Bible says. I know what God really wants me to do. But I think I can do it, and this thing that's self-serving, but you don't tell yourself that. I mean, you do. I can do it for a season. I can do it for a little while, and I can get away with it, and I can get my family ahead, I can get myself ahead. And so you start making those compromises and that rationale, and you can justify anything that way. And that's what happened for me. I know.
Yeah. One of the words that I kept thinking about as I sat down and read Ecclesiastes this morning, which, by the way, my soapbox. My soapbox is always read books in one sitting. They say that you could read this in 30 minutes, even if it's twice that and it's an hour. It's really a short read, and I think reading it in one sitting is really incredibly powerful, especially with this book. But as I was reading it, I kept thinking about, even though this isn't a word that the Kohelet, the teacher, uses, I don't think very often, if at all, but I kept thinking about greed and how many times the Bible, especially the New Testament, talks about greed. Greed can be defined as desiring to have more than is due. And I mean, by that definition, that's all of us, to some degree, and we live in a world that greed is seductive and it is deceitful, but that's the thing, is that I have known Christians that have confessed to lots of different sins. Very seldom, if ever, have I ever had someone, or have I ever confessed to someone else, "Hey, I'm really struggling with being greedy." Yet this is one of the things that we're told, this will keep you out of the kingdom of God. Like, that you cannot be a follower of Jesus and be greedy, which means to desire more than is due. So it's not just to have more than is due, but it is to even want it, to desire it, to pursue it. And how many of us, again, don't want or daydream about or think, man, it would be nice. And that's really the life. And oh, wouldn't it be great to be able to travel first class? And wouldn't it be great to, we may never have those things, but it's the greed for them, the desire for them, the ambition for them. And then we read Ecclesiastes. I'm going to read a couple verses. I'm curious to hear your thoughts too, but, some of the things that it says, Ecclesiastes 4:4, this is from the New Living Translation. It says, "Then I observed that most people are motivated to success because they envy their neighbors, but this too is meaningless, like chasing after the wind." Ecclesiastes 6:9, "Enjoy what you have rather than desiring what you don't have, Just dreaming about nice things is meaningless, like chasing the wind. And there's just so much there. And again, I mean, I think that what you're describing is an experience that even though we haven't all had the same experience, we've all had the exact same temptation, the same struggles, the same desires, the same ambitions, and so thank you for sharing that story with us because you lived out and are explaining exactly what Ecclesiastes has to say.
Yeah. So I did what you suggested, which was I always know I have the little West on my shoulder, right? That says, "Hey, you should really read this book."
You need a better angel on your shoulder,
I
but
listen to so Ecclesiastes is hard.
Mm,
First of all, the language, like I read ESV
mhm.
typically, not King James version or and even in ESV, it's a little stilted, it's a little hard, it's maybe a little poetic, or it's structured in a way that it's not like friendly to the American ear, and just my personal
Yeah,
opinion.
yeah.
So that makes it difficult. And then whatever you read, then you got to say, oh yeah, wait a second, that's the teacher, or Tim Mackey calls it the critic,
Yeah,
and it's the middle-aged man who's seen it all, and that's his description, which I think is pretty cool.
yeah.
And so then you have to put on these other glasses where the author, the person at the very beginning and the very end, he comes in and says, okay, yes, so let me tell you the conclusion of all these things: fear
Yeah.
God and keep his command. And then you have to put on another pair. If I had my sunglasses, I would, is like that Mel, the point he made the other night, all of these comments are made without consideration of Jesus,
Yeah.
and so it's difficult to understand what's being said.
Sure.
It's a challenging book in that regard.
Yeah.
Then you put somebody in a pressure cooker, and that pressure cooker could be a young family with kids, or a career path where you're making, high stakes decisions about where my little company goes, or
Mm.
how do I address this issue in my family or with my extended family. What happened in the midst of all of this that I'm telling you about? I had kids that are about ready to go off to college. I had parents facing end of life issues. I had frustrations with a community of believers. I don't want to really go into that too much, but I'm here, so right.
Yeah.
And so that there's another backdrop and another layer to all this, and so all of that piled on, and now you want to sit down with Ecclesiastes and make sense of that and your life, and make the proper course corrections. That's a lot to ask
Yeah.
for somebody who's a knucklehead, who's flying by the seat of his pants trying to make his way in this world.
Yeah.
So I think a little grace to people in their 20s and their 30s
Yeah.
as they're trying to figure things out. And I think as those who are older, um, we need to help people
Yeah.
become part of their life and help them see, look, friend, um, have you thought about this?
Yeah.
Have you seen this? And I just didn't let that person in. I didn't have that person willing to be part of my life, and I would like to be that person for others,
Yeah.
if ever given the opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah. So what has stuck out to you? We've been studying through Ecclesiastes this quarter, and you've been teaching and helping to teach this book. So what has stuck out to you? What do you wish that you had known when you were younger? What do you wish that somebody, a wise, loving brother in Christ, might have taken you aside and shared wisdom with you? What do you think? Whether or not you would have been at the place where you could receive that, what do you wish, or what have you gained from this book?
Yeah. I think that uh, this is hard, because I think the most tragic part of what I told you about today, and we've already alluded to this, is that on some level I knew all of this.
Mm.
I've studied it. I preached. I taught Bible classes from it, so I had the background and I knew the stories. I've been in the church, or grew up with parents who taught these things my entire life, and yet it still can get out from under you
Yeah.
when you let your ambitions get the best of you. Um, I would say that boy, that is hard. Beyond that, I'm not so sure. Uh, I would say that be honest with yourself. Are you are you justifying something that you want to do? Are you really Do you really think you're helping the cause of Christ? Are you really think you're living for God? Or is there part of you somewhere deep inside that's really doing it to elevate yourself, and elevate your physical livelihood. And there's no shame in that, but you need to be honest with yourself and your intentions. I mean, you do have to provide for your family,
Sure.
and you do have to it's like eating, and I clearly, I mean, I could stand I had a shirt with a grid paper, basically, and then I realized that the angle would, like, allow you to count the number of grid squares and see just how overweight Bob is. So I decided to put on a black
I
sweat.
really hope nobody is going to that trouble.
Oh, yes. So it's a lot like eating, though, where you have to do it, but you have to do it in moderation. And the same thing is with work and ambition. You have to have ambition. You have to. I love what Mel said last night about the need to, as you get older, even to continue to foster ambition in your life and to be relevant and to have impact in this world,
Yeah.
like we're called to do, and yet to keep that in check.
Yeah.
And I think that the thing about Ecclesiastes, the cathedrals, I heard that they were built in such a way as to make you feel insignificant when you walked in. Have you ever heard that
No.
about the
Yeah.
construction of cathedrals?
Oh, and
Yeah, large, towering. I was at Westminster Abbey. I got to visit there, and you definitely get that sense of this is massive, and there's hundreds of years of, history and how insignificant I am, and I don't even buy into the Church of England necessarily. Um, but I think Ecclesiastes is a lot like that. It's the repeated use of hevel, hevel, hevel. This too is hevel. And I mean, on one level, it is like um existential crisis inducing to hear that and to see, like, well, then what's the point of anything?
yeah.
Right. But um I think that it's good to have all of the things that you think you care about stripped away, and you're laid bare against the word of God. And what are my intentions? Are they pure, or am I doing this for some other reason?
Yeah.
And just be if you and the word of God in the room together. And I mean, the truth about your intentions comes out, at
Yeah.
least to you, hopefully, if
Yeah.
you're honest with yourself.
Yeah. As I read through it this morning, I was thinking that one of the things that I've never really thought of before as I was reading Ecclesiastes, and that's balance. There's almost this sense of the foolishness of obsession with whatever that obsession might be, whether it is pleasure seeking or wealth building or even wisdom seeking. Ironically, in a book that is all about wisdom and the benefit of wisdom, there's even this idea that, hey, even the wise people are gonna die, and the foolish people are gonna die, and the rich people and the poor people and the people that have all the pleasure and the people that are miserable, everybody's gonna die. And there is a sense in which that is morbid and kind of depressing, but there's also a sense which the Kohelet, the teacher, is encouraging people. So take that into consideration and enjoy your life. We say things like stop and smell the roses, and that's good advice. That doesn't mean it's wise to spend all your time smelling roses. Like, no, no, no. Go get a job too. Like, you can't just sit around smelling roses all day. You have to smell, you have to do both. You have to work, you have to take care of your family, but you also have to stop and smell the roses. And I think that's the wisdom of Ecclesiastes, is that you gotta work, but you also have to enjoy your life. And if you work so hard that you never stop to enjoy it and then you die, what a miserable existence that would be. And so I think there really is a lot of wisdom in there. And he even encourages people, it's better to go to funerals than go to parties. The end of something is better than the beginning of something because there's wisdom in it. And it helps you to realize, oh, I'm taking things for granted, and it's not going to last forever. And I really and I mean, praise God that you took time to enjoy with your kids, even in the
Yeah.
midst of all of that. That you had the wisdom to enjoy that time with your kids, even though there were other things that went by the wayside. You at least were doing that.
Yeah, and I think the other good thing that comes out the other side of this is the realization, as I read through Ecclesiastes and think about my life, is that, I don't know, I'm not going to ascribe the success or the failure to anything God did. I make enough of my own stupid decisions that I'm sure it was as much me as time and chance, which the teacher says happens to everyone. I mean, there's always somebody with more money who's going to come in and own a space and things
Mhm.
of that nature. But I do know this, that that Bob, that version of Bob in 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, he was not fit for service. There was no room for him for God to use him in the way that he needed to be used. He needed to be brought low. He needed to have a lot of his ego excised from him. He needed to have a lot his priorities put in the right place. And so, praise God that I learned that lesson earlier than later.
Yeah.
And, but yeah, I love Tim Mackey. I've told you that so many times.
Yeah.
In fact, if I can just take a moment here, like there were three people I feel like, well, number one was my wife, right? And God. But there were three individuals that helped me get back on a path. Listening to your podcast and listening to your sermons was huge. And I appreciate that. And I think people who don't attend here and who may only listen to your podcast may not understand just am I wrong to say that he is beloved by this congregation and that many of us, our conversations outside of church have to do with just how great of a sermon this last Sunday was, how uplifted we are, or whatever? That might be something that your audience doesn't get a sense of, but how appreciative the people here are and how I am appreciative of you and your willingness to share your wisdom. And I just pray for your health and your safety and your ongoing work in the kingdom. So that's number one. I got to give a shout out to Keith Lancaster, who I followed my whole life from a teenager. I was a fan and then got to know him personally and had a good relationship with him. And he is actually one of one of the people that encouraged me to start coming here. And so we've had many conversations. So when I told him, it was a joyous moment. I got to speak with him and Sharon about those things. And then, Tim Mackey, who, we listened to Bible Project and Tim Mackey's individual sermons, and it brought me closer to Jesus
Yeah,
as well.
absolutely.
And so Tim, he talks about the two characters in Ecclesiastes. There's the author who speaks at the very beginning and the very end, and then there's the critic, the teacher, the preacher, the quester, as they call him in the Message. I don't even know what
Sure.
that is,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah, the quester. He says that the critic knows the pursuit of godly wisdom and the fear of the Lord is the right thing to do. But since you can't control your life, you should stop trying, hold things with an open hand.
Yeah.
You really only have control of one thing, your attitude towards the present moment. Um, and I mean, sometimes we mischaracterize, I think, the critic as being somebody who's only negative and
Yep.
only looking at things from under the sun, and that's not necessarily true. And I
Mm.
appreciate the way that Tim framed it; it brought it out a little bit better. And so the critic is saying, "Stop worrying, choose to enjoy the simple pleasures. A good conversation with a friend, sun on your face, a good meal with people you care about." And not just the partying, but also funerals and other things that might be perceived as bad because both are rich gifts from God. And so, what does Ecclesiastes teach that you wish you had understood when you were younger? Um, you know, uh, I knew to stop worrying that the events of life are uncontrollable, but I thought I could take massive action like Tony Robbins. I used to listen to those tapes and countless hours of toil to force my will and to make things happen. And to some extent you can, but it's not sustainable. And there's a price to be paid. You cannot, as a Christian, tell God that his will need to wait. You need to be aware of that at all times. And I knew that simple pleasures are the best. There's that phrase, and then there's a Bobby McFerrin song that I always sing in my head. Simple pleasures are the best. But I wasn't satisfied with simple pleasures. I wanted the trappings of wealth. And I guess I was an influencer. I didn't think of myself as such. But when you have so many people like giving you props for no good reason, really. I didn't create the programming language. I didn't create the framework or any of these sorts of things, but I got a lot of accolades as if I had. That was not earned, but I wanted the trappings of it, even though it wasn't earned. And I struggled to control my attitude in the present moment. I would get frustrated and mad. So all these are things that, you asked, what would Ecclesiastes teach somebody who is willing to listen,
Yeah.
who is overly ambitious? And I think that, um, you know, the lessons are to fear God and keep his commandments.
Yeah, and isn't that it? And I mean, there's so much there, and I love that journey of Ecclesiastes of figuring out, and sometimes we have to learn the hard way, but figuring out that life is hevel, it's vanity, it's chasing after the wind, but then there is an ambition that is worthwhile. Pursue God. And when you pursue God, when you fear him and you keep his commandments, it is worthwhile. There is success in it, there is life in it. And so even though the writer of Ecclesiastes doesn't yet have the perspective that we have, because we haven't yet seen the cross and haven't yet seen the resurrection, he knows by faith there's a reason to fear God and keep his commandments, that it's worthwhile, that this is the whole duty of man, that this is what life is really all about. Well, speaking of the simple pleasures, we I can smell lunch that is
Oh
getting
yeah.
ready, but
Well,
I do want to give our men here an opportunity if they have any questions, comments, thoughts that we can respond to. I said before we started we weren't going to do questions and answers, but we'll do questions and responses. So if anybody has any thoughts, I see a hand back here, PA, or I see a couple. So microphones are coming towards you. I'm going to keep trying to talk while we transition so that there's not dead air space. There we go.
Yeah. Hey, Bob, thanks for being so open. I'm just curious, what kind of guardrails have you put up now to really keep that selfish ambition in check, especially as you transition into, a topic like AI, which is so big right now?
yeah. Well, for me personally, I so when guardrails, I don't know that I've written these down, but I know at some point I went through my life little by little and decided what make me happy and what makes me unhappy. And um I didn't want to continue doing that. So I stopped the business. I stopped my social media presence. I don't respond to any emails. I don't have anything to do with that. I took a job in Microsoft. I'm at the lowest level as an individual contributor in the organization. I have no aspiration of moving up, and they don't expect that from me at my level. Like if I move to the next numerical level, there would be an expectation to start that climb up. But you can be at, I think I'm level 36. I think I can be at a 36 and I don't have to move up from there. Like there are people in at level 36 who can be at 36 for, 20 years. And I enjoy the fact that I don't have to worry about sales. I don't have to worry about cash coming in. And all I got to do is I can focus on the thing that I love, which is learning about technology and writing about it. I just have to make my only one person happy. Well, besides Beth and God, but I have to make my manager happy and keep that expectation. And so killing off the ego and taking a more humble, I guess you could say, role and just enjoying the process of learning. That for me, I there was a lot of crow to eat and a lot of humbling that had to happen to get to that point. But yeah, I have no aspirations of moving up in the company as a people manager. They're not clamoring to promote me, and I'm not asking to be promoted. So those are my guardrails right now. Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay, Andy? Yeah, Bob, thank you again for sharing it.
Yeah.
Appreciate you guys doing this. Um, I was curious about, I've found myself in a situation where I've been in sales for 23 years on the med device space. I started off loving it, everything about it. And then as I went along, it just became more of a grind. And also, smaller companies got bought up. And now I find myself struggling with working for a larger California-based company that does not share my values. And I struggle with justifying being there and taking a paycheck from a company that, that I think does not stand for what I believe in, but I also, as we said, have to support my family. And I was just curious what your thoughts on something that would be, because obviously Microsoft has a bit of controversy, just like pretty much all the major corporations do.
Yeah, I want to remind everybody what I said earlier that I am the views and opinions expressed. No, that yeah, and so I've that has crossed my mind, and I've talked to other Christians about those sorts of things. I think that uh, I prov- I so I grew up in a non-institutional Church of Christ, and I went to a Catholic university, and I got some flack for going to Loyola University of Chicago because it was a Jesuit university. And I talked to people about that. I was just concerned. And they said, "Look, you're paying for a service, and you don't have to buy into everything." Um, if I was offered a role at Anheuser-Busch, and I said absolutely not. Like, that was a line that I wouldn't cross. Um, but almost every company does things that are not completely aligned with, or individuals in the company I would not align myself with. I am very apolitical. I used to be very political and used to follow those sorts of things. I am violently apolitical now, where I don't, that's not, I was so happy to hear Wes preach the series of lessons over the summer because he expressed my viewpoint in ways that I couldn't articulate myself. But the kingdom is more important to me than that. Um, if I don't live and work in an area where I can shine my light, Jesus doesn't call us to come out of the world. He calls us to be a light in the world. And the world as is messy, and not everybody agrees with it. But I figure, hey, my manager on Friday asked, "Hey, what are you doing this weekend, Bob?" I'm like, "Funny you should ask. I'm actually going to be on a Christian podcast, and I'm going to talk about Ecclesiastes, and I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to talk about that." And I didn't necessarily preach the entire gospel to my manager and to the people in the meeting, but that was an opportunity to shine light in that moment. And so I'm not going to shy away from that. I don't have to align myself to everything that any organization calls itself to. But I do feel like compelled to be in the middle of where I'm needed most.
Okay. I have a question for Wes. It came in your teaching as we introduced Ecclesiastes as a Bible class. You use the analogy of a sandcastle.
Mhm.
So how can that sandcastle example help us in our work life?
Oh man, yeah, that's how I've come to think about the hevel idea is that it's because it's temporary, and it doesn't mean that a sandcastle isn't good or serve a purpose or yeah, I guess could be useful in a sense, but yeah, you just have to recognize that it is going to come down. It doesn't mean don't build one. It doesn't mean don't do this. It doesn't mean don't have a job. It doesn't mean don't have a career. It just means understand what it is. It's limited. It's going to be here for a limited time. Same thing with so many things. This country, we were talking about politics. I mean, this country is it's limited. It's hevel. Like it doesn't mean don't be involved in the things that are going on in the community, but it means recognize what it is. And so, yeah, have a job, do well at your job, do the best that you can do. I think about Jeremiah 29. I think about the exiles in Babylon that you're supposed to seek the welfare of the city, seek the welfare of your company. It doesn't mean that you agree with everything Babylon is doing or everything your company is doing, but you can seek their welfare because your welfare is tied to their welfare, but also understand this too shall pass. It's temporary. Babylon is temporary. Your company is temporary. The country is temporary.
Mine's more of a comment, just kind of bringing together several things that Mel said last night about um, the message of Ecclesiastes in light of Jesus, and then what both of you mentioned at various times in the podcast about this existential crisis that comes out of Ecclesiastes, and I love that because in light, I mean, I almost wish, when we sat down to teach the gospel that we just went through Ecclesiastes first before we ever did that, because I almost feel like when we make a realization that we need Jesus, that is an existential crisis that has to happen.
Yeah.
And I love what you said, Bob, about like having to strip down to the just bareness of everything. And, when you realize that you need a savior, it's because you've just been stripped down to just the bareness of your existence. And it's like, okay, where do I go from here? And so I love that we've kind of tied Ecclesiastes really kind of right into the gospel, and I've never really thought of it that way. So thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to stop. I think that's a great place to stop because I think you're exactly right, Aaron, that the book of Ecclesiastes, it exposes the reality that we're all aware of, but we haven't necessarily embraced, that all the things that we're investing in are going to come to an end. In fact, life itself is going to come to an end. And Jesus is the only hope of that. Jesus, if you want to live, and we all do, the fact that we're pursuing anything, that we're ambitious towards anything, shows that we want life, not just to exist, but we want the good life. And Jesus is that. When we recognize and realize that all of this stuff is not the good life, then it leaves us asking, then what is? Then who is? And the answer is Jesus. So, Bob, thank you for this conversation. Men, thank you for your thoughts, your comments, your questions, your presence. Thank you to everybody who is listening. Now, let's all go out and love like Jesus.